Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 131. It's been quite a while since I did a solo episode, so I'm going to tackle this one by myself. It's a topic that's actually gotten a lot of attention over the past few years, not just in baseball, but across a number of different sports. We're going to talk about workload management. And I think where we're going to attack it just a little bit differently with this particular podcast is we're going to speak to how it's not really just a one-size-fits-all approach about how what you do for young kids in the baseball realm versus major leaguers, people with a lot of experience, might actually be markedly different. So we're going to talk basically about the interaction between load and capacity and how we impact both of those different factors in this equation. So hopefully this is something that you'll be able to take and implement with your training and how you manage your players and your kids if you're in the parenting world. But I think just as importantly, I think there'll be some lessons across other sports as well as we work our way through this. So look forward to it. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. One scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients through the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY. Okay, as I mentioned in the intro, we are going to tackle a topic that has actually gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years, this principle of workload management. And I think it's especially timely, obviously in the world right now. There are a lot of discussions about this, I think largely because of the load management kind of conversations that have taken place, particularly in the NBA over the last couple of years, but you have had it trickle into some different sports as well. But I think also just in general, sports science, performance science, these are really emerging industries. You see every professional team and a lot of colleges really investing a lot of resources here, hiring some super bright people from all walks of life to really contribute to kind of building this body of knowledge so that we can better support our athletes, prepare them better for competition, but also help them really rebound. And one of the most important things I think we can do to make this a little bit more baseball specific is just to reflect on maybe some of the interactions that I've had with colleagues from different realms. One of the things that's cool about Cressey Sports Performance is we've had a collection of interns that have gone on to be, head strength and conditioning coaches, directors of performance in, the NHL and NBA. We have folks that are working in football. So you get to stay in touch with them and have conversations. And what's always interesting is how stunned my peers are in other industries, other sports, at how many games are played in a short amount of time in baseball. And, and certainly in Major League Baseball calendar, it's a 162 game schedule with, spring training on the front end and postseason on the tail end if you're on a really strong team. We're talking about over 200 games in roughly 230 days. Maybe they get, 2 days off in a month. And in many cases, they lose those when there's a rain out. You have to play a double header. Actually know of a scenario where we played 3 games in 32 hours with a flight across the time zone mixed in the middle. So you just don't ever see that in any other sports. But what's really interesting is if you look at the college, high school, and even younger realms, you'll see kids play 7 games in 2 days in like amateur basketball. But in baseball, you could play double headers both Saturday and Sunday. And a situation like that, if you're a 14-year-old kid, if you're dehydrated, you're really playing from behind the 8 ball for a huge chunk of the weekend. So I do think we just need to appreciate that baseball is very different than basketball, football, hockey, some of these other sports, just because of the number of games that are played. And I think that, a lot of times we maybe overlook that just because baseball is a game that has a lot of standing around, right? There's a little bit of action, and then, there's 5 minutes before something cool happens. And, you might be a right fielder that jogs out to right field and then jogs back to the dugout, for all 9 innings of the game. You might not see an absolute, a single play to keep you entertained. So I think we need to be mindful that still stress, being on your feet all day, being in cleats for such a long season. It's different than what we get in other sports. And what we realize very quickly is, if you look at the NBA, the NHL, and certainly the NFL where they play once a week, the games are less frequent. So you can buy off days a lot easier than you can in the baseball world. So in the baseball world, you can't afford to get behind the 8 ball. So I've used the hackneyed expression that I stole from my business partner, Shane Rye. It's listen when it whispers instead of waiting for it to yell. And I think you have to do that in baseball more than anywhere else, just because if you do get caught behind, it becomes very, very challenging to make it up because the gameplay is so frequent. But at the end of the day, I think if we need to really wrap our heads around, this whole concept of workload management, we have to realize that this entire discussion is centered around the interaction between load and capacity. It's overly simple, but I think we have to do that, and then we can look a little bit more detailed underneath both of those categories. And we have both acute and chronic injuries, and we have acute and chronic interventions that may impact how load and capacity impact those injuries. So in an acute injury, right, whether you're talking about an ACL rupture on a change of direction, or a collision with an outfield wall, or a hamstring strain that happens when someone steps on a bag reaching to kind of beat out an infield grounder, we realize that there's a high load that exceeds a tissue's capacity for loading. So you get a rupture, you get a fracture, you get something like that. And in an acute injury, there are times when it's something that's completely outside of our control. Think about a car accident, right? If your shin hits the dashboard and you rupture your PCL, like there's nobody on the planet who has the strength to basically overcome, the forces involved in a situation like that. And certainly that may be the exact same case if an individual gets tackled on the football field and they get that posterior tibial translation and they rupture their PCL. Like that's life. That's the happenstance that happens in sports. Similar to getting hit by pitches, things like that happen. But we also have to realize that a lot of those acute injuries may have been building, right? So the example of the person straining a hamstrings as they reach for the bag, there could have been a tendinopathy that was in place that built and built and built. And that particular load exceeded a tissue's capacity for loading, and it happened traumatically. But at the other end of the spectrum, we also have chronic injuries, right? So a chronic load, eventually builds to the point that the tissue can't handle it any longer. So this may be, the pitcher who's thrown a ton of innings and not had issues, and then, one day they just wake up and their shoulder's barking at them, and they go to play catch. And this often, interesting, you always, will see injuries across baseball where people come in hurting after an off day. So it's kind of like an interesting thing where like, all right, what happened? Did you do anything? Or is it just one of those things where load was building and building and building, and it eventually got to that threshold where it exceeded your capacity for it. And what we have to realize is that every one of our interventions In a strength and conditioning, sports medicine realm, or even if we're talking about really clinical, what a doctor might do, they all work by stabilizing load or reestablishing capacity. And so that's going to be a big framework for this discussion that we're working through today. So we have both acute interventions and we have chronic interventions that work to do that. So if we look at an acute intervention, we adjust the pitch count, right? We modify how much load can be thrown into the system, right? That's something that's been implemented with success in the younger age groups, although it's a little bit debatable, I think, probably more than it should be. We also have situations where maybe we provide hydration or nutrition, right? We give someone who's dehydrated water that helps to reestablish their capacity to handle whatever load is thrown at them. We can implement, manual therapy or things like Mark Pro or red light therapy or BFR, some of these recovery modalities that may help them to reestablish capacity quicker. You're not fundamentally changing the load on their tissue. What you're doing is you're basically giving them a better environment in which they can bounce back from that loading. And so those are very acute things, right? Modifying pitch count, giving them a drink of water, throwing in some of these things. But there's also chronic interventions. And that works, in my experience, way more on this concept of stabilizing load, right? Because we get progressive overload in our strength and conditioning programs, our throwing programs, so that we can build work capacity in both a general and specific sense. So the idea is simply we're making a more robust athlete. And this kind of underscores the conversations, the debates that are happening in the industry where, you always see people that tend to gravitate towards one side of the sports science equation, right? Do we build a really robust athlete that can handle anything, or do we meticulously manage workloads so that people don't get into a bad situation? My experience has been that the answer is right in the middle, right? You have athletes that need to build more work capacity, and then you have some athletes that have built a ton of capacity, are chronically overworked, and we need to give them more tools to be successful from actually bouncing back to the workload they prepared themselves for. So these are very different discussions across different populations. So it's important that we outline a framework through which we can actually work to attack them. One of these frameworks that I like to use is the law of repetitive motion. And I'd actually encourage you to take out a piece of paper while you're listening to this and write out this equation. I equals NF over AR. So NF are your numerators, AR are your denominators, and I, which is the injury or the insult to the tissue, is the outcome. And what we realize is, we can certainly work directly on the injury itself, whether we, do some dry needling, some manual therapy. Sometimes that insult may be like a bursitis that responds well to a cortisone injection or something like that. And certainly kind of foam rolling on a daily basis probably attacks this, in an indirect way. But really the most important things for reducing the injury that you're indult to the tissue is to work on those four factors. So, certainly the N, the number of repetitions, we can reduce that, right? So we can throw fewer pitches. That's one option. We can also try to reduce the F, which is the force of each repetition. And we have to take into account that this is actually expressed as a percentage of maximal strength. So if we make an athlete stronger, this number is inherently smaller. And this is why some people go to physical therapy and just work on strengthening, even independent of the rest, and they actually get better. And it's a little bit more of a loaded discussion for another day, but I think in the context of this discussion, if we make an athlete stronger and we minimize the number of repetitions, we work really, really well on the top side of that kind of equation. But on the bottom, we have AR, which is amplitude and rest. So amplitude, we can add range of motion to the system. This may be an important thing for an athlete who doesn't have a great deceleration pattern, right? We give them a longer runway. We teach them to work into their front hip. We give them some thoracic rotation, some scapular upward rotation, all these things that allow them to have a little bit more of a runway over which they can produce force and also dissipate force. And then certainly we can add rest to the system. We can give somebody an extra day between starts. We can also, create a situation where they're hanging at the end of a season and we just give them some time without a baseball in their hands. These are all really, easy ways to implement it. So I equals NF over AR. I've written about this a bunch on my website. If you search for the law of repetitive motion at ericcressey.com, it'll give you some insights on how you can attack this, but it absolutely applies to every single injury scenario that we encounter. And it's a great framework you can utilize in the context of this load and capacity discussion, because we're ultimately using our acute and chronic interventions on both the load and the capacity front to impact this equation. But I think it's really important as we build on this that we talk about whether we're discussing youth athletes or adult athletes, because they're very different. In kids, we typically see a very low capacity because they haven't participated in consistent strength and conditioning for long enough. We also know they're not skeletally mature, so we tend to see more, or I should say less capacity of the skeletal system, the bones, and that's why they're so susceptible to growth plate injuries. And because throwing a baseball is the single fastest motion in all sports, it's a recipe for injuries. It's high load in low capacity athletes. And I think underneath this umbrella, the extra concerning ones are the tall kids, right? We know there's every little league on the country has that 6'1", 12-year-old that throws harder than everyone else and throws downhill and scares the heck out of all of the 10-year-olds. So extra concerning are the athletes with the best anthropometric characteristics for throwing hard. Long arms, long legs. My buddy Derek Johnson, who's the pitching coach for the Reds, I remember him at a seminar one time joking that, these are arms that are writing checks that their butts can't cash. And unfortunately, we know that the teenage brain isn't exactly well equipped for making decisions with long-term health in mind. So these kids who have, quick arms at young ages, even if they don't have the strength to support those biomechanics, in many cases, they're the ones that go out and get, absolutely abused by, coaches and, playing for multiple teams and things like that. So we need to make sure we protect guys from themselves when they have anthropometric characteristics that allow them to throw hard before they've really built a lot of capacity. And I think we have to, appreciate in this group that there's a few different ways that we can actually help them a lot. So I think the first strategy is that pitch counts matter, right? We have to protect them from themselves and not put them on multiple teams, pitching back-to-back days over weekends and things along those lines. These are actual issues, and we have tons of research that support this. Pitchsmart.org is a great website that outlines some protocols. If you need proof, go back and look at the 2006 study from Olson that looked at a number of innings pitched per year, that looked at showcase attendances, things like that all tend to predict injuries. We also need to build up gross movement capacity. So, really general capacity with good strength and conditioning. I think it's important to get kids involved in some kind of strength and conditioning, really, honestly, by 13 at the latest. And if they're excited about it, they want to start doing some body weight stuff and things like that, it can start even earlier. I wouldn't force it if they're not interested. And concurrently, they're playing multiple sports, building up this really good, kind of movement foundation upon which we can layer more of the specific stuff that comes later. So when I say specific, in the context of baseball, that means we need to do a progressive throwing program, that has hills and valleys built in over the course of the year to gradually, build up different things. I think the problem is right now we're in an industry where kids can absolutely pitch as hard as they want off a mound year round, and it flies in the face of conventional wisdom on how learning takes place and how tissues adapt and all that. So there do need to be more, kind of pronounced valleys in kids' schedules so that they're not always training specifically, but also have an opportunity to attack things in a more general sense. I think there's a time for younger players to really work hard on making sure that every throw counts. We just did a podcast with Reed Detmers that I thought was great on that front. He talked about making sure that he was always working on something with every throw and catch play. That was something his dad drilled home with him. So I think we need to be mindful of building not just general work capacity, but getting higher quality throwing sessions in as part of a progressive throwing program that builds in and out of the competitive calendar. Which leads to point number 4. You have to establish a solid yearly calendar that outlines what should happen. And this is the most heavily overlooked part of developing, adolescent athletes, is teaching them what their year should look like and working with them. Hey, if you want to play football or soccer, here's how it fits into the calendar. Let's all work, through this together. But I think the problem is that most people just fly on a whim and they don't stick to their plan, right? And what does that mean? you can't just decide to like magically go play in a tournament in the middle of November just because a coach called you and told you that he needed you. You have to have an idea of how it fits into your entire calendar. And this is the only sport where you really have to do this. Like you can go out and play, basketball, and maybe you get winded or something like that. But the incidence of injury is not going to be sky high like it is in baseball. Like you can be rusty, but go play a soccer game, and what's the worst thing that can happen? Maybe you pull a groin, or absolute worst case scenario, you tear an ACL. In baseball, you go out and you throw without preparing, you can tear a UCL and miss a year and a half. So we just need to realize that this calendar has to be sacred. We've got to set it in stone, and we've got to adhere to it, and appreciate that as part of a long-term developmental plan. And then fifth, we have to really, in this younger demographic, we have to emphasize foundational principles of recovery. So what are those? It's nutrition. It's eating high quality foods, particularly when you're on the road, not missing meals, things like that. We got to emphasize hydration, particularly on those long days at the ballpark. And then, certainly sleep. I think, this is something that, does not get nearly enough attention in these younger populations. Every parent is really focused on wanting to make sure that their kids, eat well, and certainly hydrate. But I think the sleep aspect of it gets really overlooked. Is, kids do need more sleep than, most adults do, particularly as adults get older. So I think we need to do a better job of creating an environment conducive of not just getting enough sleep, but getting high quality sleep, getting video games out of the bedroom, shutting cell phones off. Those things can go a really, really long way. And I think one of the things that's challenging is you see a lot of kids go on the road for these travel tournaments, and in many cases you got 3 or 4 kids in a room, and we know, all of us have had sleepovers when we were teenagers. It's not exactly a conducive environment for getting a ton of sleep. So if you're going to play 4 games in a weekend, you better make sure that you're sleeping sufficiently throughout that time period. So that kind of recaps what we need to do with the younger age groups. We realize that it's much, much more about building capacity, having a plan, and then, making sure that you're doing normal things to help teenagers eat, hydrate, and sleep better to set them up for success. Now, in more experienced athletes, things are going to be a bit different. So first, the impact of strength and conditioning is going to be less pronounced in these athletes on building work capacity because everyone does it, even if some do it better than others. Most of the athletes we encounter in professional baseball, particularly those that have gone to college, have a decent foundation in strength and conditioning. We might disagree with some of their approaches and maybe need to modify some things to continue progressing them, but all of them have had the newbie gains, that we come to expect of, putting on 15 pounds and getting leaner and stronger in that first year of strength training. Even the high school athletes that are drafted seem to have at least encountered that. It's very rare that you get an 18-year-old kid who is completely detrained. That's very different than dealing with 14-year-old kids who just need to establish solid foundations. I think secondly, in more experienced athletes, pitch counts can be a little bit less rigid because the overall tolerance for throwing volume is higher. So any deviation from that pitch count is a smaller percentage than in young players, right? If a young pitcher is only ready to go out and make 50 pitches and you throw him 75, that's a 50% deviation from what they would be expecting. Whereas if you take a more advanced pitcher and they go from 100 pitches to 125, it's still not great, but it's a 25% deviation from what they've been built up to. And just anecdotally, one of the things that I've seen that's kind of an interesting transition point is where you seem to see high school kids have the most issue is kind of when they go 100 pitches in back-to-back outings. You take a high school junior and he throws, one Friday and goes 103 pitches, and the next Friday goes out and throws 110. Those are usually the scenarios when they start to bark at it. Whereas college pitchers do that all the time on 70 rotations. They're a little more built up to it. So it does seem like things change pretty dramatically over a 2 to 3 period in there. And one of the things that's interesting in more advanced players, we know that the switch from reliever to starter is a problem. So, a lot of players who have, they've tried to build up too quickly and switch from relieving to starting. And there's actually some recent research that demonstrated that latissimus dorsi injuries, lat injuries in particular, seem to be associated with a quick bump in pitch count. I've certainly seen a lot of cases like that over the years where, someone threw 30 extra pitches than they ever have, and the lat started barking. So kind of an interesting, kind of workload aside there, but it does seem like we can be a little bit more aggressive on the pitch count front in experienced athletes. That's not to say that we should, but they seem to be a little more tolerant of it than younger athletes. So, it's much less of a capacity discussion with respect to strength and conditioning and throwing. Now, point number 3 is there's a lot of variability in throwing programs at the more advanced level. Some players choose to throw year round. They simply play catch for a few months at the end of the season before gradually ramping up. We did a previous podcast episode that talked about, the perks and drawbacks of continuing to throw. You'll see also, though, at higher levels, if you're a minor leaguer who's in Double A for the 4th consecutive year and you're throwing 91, that's an athlete who may be willing to commit to a more aggressive throwing program. They're willing to take more chances and really kind of like push the amount of loading to try to drive some of their capacity a little bit higher to try to create some kind of adaptation. And this also may be college seniors having crazy pitch counts. If they know they're done with baseball after that year, they may sell out for it, whether it's to win or to develop with those more aggressive throwing programs or pitch counts to try to get them, a free agent contract after they finish college, or if it's a, long-term minor leaguer, maybe they want to get to the big leagues for the first time. They're willing to take on a little bit more, kind of risk. Now, we don't do that with 14 and 15-year-old kids. It's never worth it, regardless of how nice the trophy looks, to risk a kid's health at that age. It does not make sense. And then I think the fourth, critical factor, in more advanced athletes is quality nutrition, hydration, and sleep interventions. They're always foundational, but we can get a little bit sexier with some of our recovery approaches, right? More of these athletes have access to manual therapy, whether it's in professional baseball or the college realm, or because they have the financial resources and insurance plans to go and get treatments on the side. They have access to Mark Pro, red light therapy, compression like Normatec, Theraguns, hot cold tubs, blood flow restricted recovery protocols. All these things are at their fingertip to conceivably create a more conducive environment to going out and reestablishing capacity. So it's not just about like the load aspect of it, it's actually about reestablishing capacity a lot more in these older populations, assuming that they've done things correctly early on in their developmental calendar. And we absolutely see scenarios where you see, major league pitchers who have never done a good job of actually, building capacity. Instead, they've actually, underloaded for such an extended period of time that we actually have to manage them much more like we would a high school athlete, and they often make really, really pronounced gains. So every situation is a little bit different, but I think at the end of the day, amateur athletes, younger athletes tend to be a lot different than college and professional athletes. Interestingly, to build on these discussions, we have to appreciate that other things can transly impact the capacity factors. So I'm going to, just kind of go through a list that I brainstormed coming into recording this. Sleep deprivation is one that's a really big one, and it's really sleep deprivation / stress. We actually know there's some really good research that shows that, the incidence of injuries goes sky high when athletes sleep less than 7 hours per night. We also know that we see an exponential increase in injuries actually in college athletes during exam time. So these are things that just really interfere with an athlete's ability to bounce back. It probably creates a dynamic of kind of driving without a seatbelt, but they're more susceptible to significant injuries simply because their body is stressed in a variety of ways. And every athletic intervention is another stressor. I think dehydration works very similarly. We've touched on that multiple times as we kind of talked about double headers, an extending number of games in a short amount of time, particularly when they're, combined with maybe unfamiliar travel circumstances, staying in hotels, things like that, in young kids. We know that dehydration makes people more susceptibility to not just impaired performance, but also injury. Time changes are another discussion. I've heard the, kind of old agreed upon mindset of for every time zone that you cross, it takes about 1 day to adjust. And if you go and you play a, road trip in Seattle and then you come back to the East Coast, you're covering, 3 time zones, and you've really got to catch up on sleep and in many cases go out and play games. Those are tricky, and I don't think the casual fan appreciates how many Major League Baseball games are played by players who didn't go to bed until 5:30 in the morning, simply because, on a on a Thursday night, like a getaway game, or a Sunday night getaway game, they didn't get in until until really late. So they'll often play really tired Monday and Friday nights. So those are certainly important considerations. I think vitamin D is another one that deserves consideration. We do see, low vitamin D, whether it's deficient or insufficient, across athletic populations. There was a really good study that was done at the NFL Combine that followed players that were deficient in vitamin D, and they did see a higher incidence of musculoskeletal injuries in these folks. So we need to be mindful, certainly, of how low vitamin D might impact their susceptibility to injuries. Medications, building on just kind of like supplemental stuff, there are certain medications that can cause more problems for athletes. Accutane is a medication for acne that we see, somewhat commonly in younger athletes, and there are some significant side effects from a musculoskeletal kind of health, weakness, things like that dynamic. So we have seen quite a few athletes that have seen negative reactions to that. And we've seen, plenty that have done perfectly fine with that, but it's an important conversation for kids to have with their dermatologist that, hey, I'm an active athlete, before you go in that route. There's certain antibiotics that can have, side effects in terms of, kind of muscular discomfort, and overall just, fatigue. Those are important considerations. We also know that statins, maybe more in old athletes who may have issues with their cholesterol and lipid panels. We've seen scenarios where, professional athletes have been put on statins. We do know there's some research that shows that, you are more susceptible to tendon injuries, when you take some of those. So just really important considerations. What you take might actually impact your capacity to handle a certain load. And I think that gets really, really overlooked. And it's why it's so important for us to do pre-participation, interviews and look at health histories to kind of dig in on what's actually taking place. Another one is we have to appreciate that things like anti-inflammatory medications may actually give you a false sense of capacity and leave you more susceptible to injury. So one thing, again, the casual fan may not realize is there are a lot of professional athletes who are taking, these things throughout the season, something that we don't recommend, obviously, to amateur players and things like that. You should need to take a bunch of anti-inflammatories in order to go out and pitch. But at the professional level, when you're being paid a lot of money to go out and perform, and, some of these games really, really matter into September, October, some athletes will take some of these things. And one of the things that's always intriguing is at the end of the season, you will see a number of professional baseball players who will come back and they'll come off these medications and they'll have a really rough week where everything just kind of hurts. It's almost like a little bit of a detox period, and they realize they were a lot more banged up than they thought they were. So we need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes anti-inflammatory medications can kick the can down the road, and you can actually go out and do a lot of damage. So you do a cortisone injection, you are leaving the tendons more susceptible to injury simply because you're looking for a quick fix to get somebody back out there quickly. So we need to be very mindful of how capacity can sometimes be deceiving, just because someone is asymptomatic. Building on that, there are other extrinsic factors that might impact someone's, tolerance, right? Footwear is a big one. You change your footwear and all of a sudden it's a different kind of load, and you don't have the capacity for those adjusted positions, right? So we see that a lot when, actually, I remember a Major League Baseball athletic trainer joking with me that you never do more soft tissue work on lower extremities in baseball than the day after Mother's Day, Father's Day, the 4th of July, all these days when athletes get specialty cleats. They try on a brand new set of cleats that might be slightly different than what they're wearing, and all of a sudden their Achilles, their calves, and their feet are really barking like crazy. So that's an extrinsic factor that changes the load, and capacity is very, skill specific. So you put on a brand new cleat and you're not going to be able to tolerate it nearly as much. Additionally, we saw in baseball, obviously, the change in baseballs. There were a lot of people that talked about like a slippery baseball, forcing them to have to grip more as there was a crackdown on sticky stuff. So certainly that was an extrinsic factor that it was heavily debated, but may have contributed to some forearm and elbow injuries last year. That's a big one. And then, a big one that certainly gets a lot of attention in baseball is turf. Can be really hard on people. Not all surfaces are the same. Standing on really, really hard turf is going to be markedly different than, being on grass. So you need to be mindful of, are you wearing metal or molded spikes? Some athletes on turf don't even wear spikes. They wear turf shoes. Just trying to find a way to impact the load and the capacity dynamic, when you have these extrinsic factors that you're honestly not able to change. In terms of intrinsic factors, one that I think that's really, really overlooked is that if you have a structural deviation from normalcy, that can make you more susceptible to acute overload. So as an example, take an athlete who's got a bad hip, something that has bony overgrowth, femoral acetabulum impingement, maybe has a cartilage defect, maybe it's got some loose bodies floating around in there, maybe it's got a labral tear or something like that. And that athlete goes out to dinner with his teammate who has a completely clean hip, and they sit in the same bench, at the restaurant. One gets up after an hour and his hip is killing him, and the other one feels perfectly fine. It was the same exact stressor, but one athlete had a structural deviation from normalcy, or a collection of them, that made that hip cranky after being in that position for an extended period of time. And it's why we know some athletes respond poorly to long flights or sleeping in hotel rooms with new pillows or whatever it is. They may have more negative reactions than other teammates. So that's an intrinsic factor, and we may need to be mindful of, hey, how do we give them a little bit more variability so they're not just hanging on that? We know athletes who have Bennett's lesions in their shoulder, are probably more susceptible to some rotator cuff irritation. These are all things that we need to be mindful of as we're trying to manage, this overall dynamic of load and capacity. It's not just a function of like what we do, it's also a function of who we are. To kind of tie a bow on this, what are some of the big recommendations? I think number one, you have to appreciate whether you have a load or a capacity problem, or both. Most athletes probably need to look at both, but as we mentioned, more often than not, in the young group, we need to build more capacity, and in the older group, we probably need to be mindful of how we manage load and then give interventions to kind of like assist with reestablishing capacity. I think most people with capacity problems, unfortunately, are blind to it and constantly spin their wheels. And I think, honestly, it's a baseball podcast, but, tennis is a community that's a really good example. So many tennis folks, they hire a fitness coach, and it's wordplay, but they always call it a fitness coach and never a strength conditioning coach. What do? They get someone that gets them to go out and run cones on the courts. They do more conditioning, more, high level aerobic / anaerobic conditioning on the court, and they never actually build a strength foundation. So they're building capacity in the wrong way. And I think, that's something that, is prevalent across all sports, but it's just the one that kind of jumps out at me the most. We have to realize that, there's both general capacity and specific capacity. And then we have to ask, do you need interventions that transiently restore it? In professional sports, we'll see people that create teams. They have strong manual therapy folks. They have nutritionists. They have sleep specialists. They have all these different people, sports psychologists, who can contribute to them, basically restoring capacity easier. So looking at things like nutrition, hydration, sleep, are very foundational, but there may be ways, particularly as athletes get more advanced, to get a little sexier with it. And the last thing I would say is remember that load problems often require hard decisions, right? If you have too much load on the system, it means you have to be willing to pull back. That might mean you only play for one team. It might mean you play catch and instead of doing extreme long toss. Maybe you skip a bullpen and just throw a shorter flat ground and, working on feel instead of just elite velocity. There's all these different ways that you can manipulate load to bring yourself back into, kind of a good position of checks and balances between these two. But at the end of the day, it always is going to, in some cases require, making a hard decision where you're willing to pull back. So like I said, I'm tying a bow on this one, but really at the end of the day, this workload management conversation is a discussion of both load and capacity, how they interact with one another. And like I said, it's always going to be population specific. So you need to take a step back and think about where you fit into this equation. And if you're a coach, you need to appreciate that every kid on your team might be a little different. Some kids are going to be more developed, more prepared than others. And you can't expect everyone else to come up to their level, but at the same time, you can't bring them down to everyone else's level, because then you detrain them and you miss out on a lot of important development. And that's the challenge in coaching, is it's an art as much as it is as a science, and it's heavily reliant on just knowing your athletes, communicating with them regularly so that you can best set them up for success. So thank you very much for listening.